I'm Emer, and I'm going to talk to you today about just transition. I'm really delighted to be here as part of the Climate and Nature Summit. I work with Global Action Plan, and we support people in their schools, communities, and businesses to learn about and take action for climate and nature. I worked as a teacher for a long time before my role here in Global Action Plan, and I've always been interested in issues around justice and equality and environment. So it's great to have a chance to bring all these things together and to talk to you a little bit today. So, just transition, what does it mean? Let's have a little think. What do you think of when you think of the words just and transition? So maybe you've never heard the term before in your life, no problem there at all. Maybe you've got a bit of familiarity with it, that's also great. We're going to dissect it a little bit and come to terms with the words a little bit together before we dig into some of the context. So I want you just to take a minute to write down as many words as you can think of for the word just and the word transition. Okay, so off you go. Time up. Maybe you came up with some of these words for just: fair, lawful, unbiased, right. Some of those words. Or maybe for transition, you've got words like different, new, change, momentum, evolution. Just life, it's kind of a fact of life. We go through many transitions throughout our lives. And then maybe improve or challenge, or maybe both, and that's kind of two sides of the coin. So maybe things are improving, but it can be challenging to adapt to change. So transition is the process or a period of changing from one condition or state to another. And of course, change is constant, but some transitions have kind of a major historical importance, such as the transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable or green energy. Arguably, we're in the midst of two major transitions right now. We've got the digital transition and we've got the green transition, and both have major implications for workforce and for society. So the conclusion of the scientific community is very clear, that we need to move away from high polluting, carbon intensive systems and societies towards more regenerative practices and sustainable societies. However, it's important to remember that we need to make sure these transitions are as fair and equitable as possible, and that they don't end up creating more problems around human rights for the communities affected. So as we explore these solutions and potential systems change in the Climate and Nature Summit, try to bear that in mind. So just transition is all about balance. This image illustrates three major things to consider in the context of sustainable development and the green transition. They are environment, social or people, and economy. So transition should be bearable, equitable and viable, and respect the planetary boundaries. So simple, yeah? I wish. So there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the weighting of these three elements is rarely equitable or equal, and that the balance is then kind of thrown out of kilter. So do you think one element is in the diagram is given more weight than others when it comes to decisions around the green transition? Which one? I want you to take 10 seconds and I want you to pick one that you think is given more weight. Thanks. So keep that initial thought in mind as we start to delve a little bit deeper. First, we're going to learn a little bit about where the term just transition came from, and we're going to touch on how it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're also going to talk a little bit about power and the communities affected by climate action. So, first, a little bit of history. The concept of a just transition was developed in the US in the 70s and 80s when environmental justice movement and the unions protested that the wealth and benefits of polluting industries were held by the few, while the toxic waste and the pollution, the burden of all of that, fell primarily on workers and those in marginalised communities. So that became a very important movement. And in the 90s, the Just Transition Alliance, led by this guy in the picture there, Tony Mazzocchi, led a campaign for looking for funding to provide workers exposed to toxic chemicals, kind of funding and education to transition out of their hazardous jobs. The term was later adopted by the International Labour Organization, so a worldwide workers' union, and they produced a document in 2015 called Guidelines for a Just Transition Towards Environmentally Sustainable Economies and Societies for All. And this document outlined a range of recommendations for governments with regards to workers' rights in the context of sustainable development and decarbonisation. It resulted in the term just transition being included in the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement requires that countries take action to deal with greenhouse gases while also ensuring a just transition of the workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs. And in terms of more recent developments then, we have the Just Transition Mechanism, which is part of the EU Green Deal. And the Just Transition funding as part of that mechanism aims to enable regions and people to address the impacts of the transition towards the Union's 2030 targets for energy and climate. So the importance of a just transition is also reflected in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The goals are a plan agreed to by all world leaders to build a fairer, greener and better world by 2030. Coordinated action to protect the planet and people are central to achieving these aims. And the 2030 vision leaves no one behind. And that idea of leaving no one behind is central to just transition frameworks. We're going to pause there for a few minutes just to have a little think. Quite a lot of information in that intro. So now let's consider the communities. Who do we think is most at risk of being left behind in the green transition? Who is on the front line? Think about here in Ireland as well as globally. So I'd like to invite you now to just pause your video, just press pause and take 3 to 5 minutes just to come up with a list of communities or people that you think are most affected. Of course, all of us will be affected to some extent by this transition, and everyone deserves a just transition, but there is a focus on particular communities of workers. These communities are quite diverse, and there are many populations and workforces that could be negatively impacted by climate action. For example, by losing jobs and livelihoods due to the ecological impact of the industries that they work in. So globally, most focus is on coal, oil, shale, peat and other carbon-intensive regions of the world. In Ireland, the main focus has been on the Midlands area of the country due to the significance of peat extraction for that region. In the early years of the Irish state, the ESB and Bord na Móna were huge indigenous industries which successfully electrified the country. The ESB was actually the world's first publicly owned energy system. And these industries fueled Ireland's economic growth. Large sections of the Midlands region were highly dependent on peat extraction for their livelihoods, therefore, and these communities are at high risk of being left behind in the transition away from fossil fuels. The Just Transition Fund, which is part of the European Green Deal, has focused on the Midlands region for this reason. The fund aims to focus on enabling regions to address the social, employment, economic and environmental impacts of the green transition. We at GAP are currently working alongside the Irish Architecture Foundation on a place-based community project with former peat workers in the Midlands called Reimagine. Through this work, the concept of just transition has been central, and I'm going to share some insights into what we've learned to try and give you a better understanding of the people being affected and to invite you to consider whether you think the transition they're experiencing is fair. The images you can see here depict briquettes there on the top left. You can see industrial peat extraction also, and there's an advert that is from the 1950s recruitment drive for peat workers. Bord na Móna was founded in 1946 to harvest peat for energy production, and there were two main aims here. First, to provide energy for security for an independent Ireland, and second, to provide jobs and development opportunities for the Midlands region. And this was another massive transition. Workers moved from all over Ireland and further afield to work with the semi-state company, and many were housed in purpose-built housing schemes designed by architect Frank Gibney. This would have been a massive improvement in the living standards of the workers who moved there. Things like indoor plumbing, separate rooms, affordable rent, they all would have been highly sought after. There were major perks of living in this kind of community. So there was steady work, guaranteed secure employment, good housing, good paying conditions, and a great sense of community and camaraderie. And there was also the sense of being part of something bigger, a national scheme of development, and there was a real sense of purpose attached to that. These workers were really driving the national economy as well as improving their own life and living conditions. So, we might look back at the Venn diagram that we looked at the beginning and just to think about how did this transition in the 50s fit in. I want you to take 10 seconds to discuss with the person next to you what you think. Was any element particularly more considered than others? Okay, so in the 1950s, the transition they experienced was great for people and the economy. It was a massive change in the living conditions, massive improvement, and we had an indigenous economy for the first time, basically, and we had electrified the country. However, we now know that it was extremely detrimental to the environment. So peat bogs act as carbon sinks, and healthy peatlands store a quarter of all soil carbon, even though they make up only 3% of the Earth's land area. So it's really vital that we conserve them. They're also really important habitats for a huge range of endangered species. So it's essential that we restore and rehabilitate our damaged bogs, as damaged bogs actually emit instead of storing carbon. It's urgent and it's essential work. It's important, however, not to demonise. So things that happened in the past, we need to learn from them and move forwards. We know, and the communities in the Midlands know, that we need to move away from fossil fuels and to move towards renewables in order to achieve our climate targets and to ensure a livable future for all. And this is why the Midlands area of the country is the focus of so much conversation around just transition. With the knowledge of the environmental impact of peat extraction, a plan was drawn up to wind down industrial peat extraction over a 20-year period and to completely cease by 2030. However, a number of plants actually closed a lot more abruptly than that, with very little planning, very little notice in and around the year 2020. This sent shockwaves through the local communities. So, what element in the Venn diagram do you think was neglected in this instance? How does this abrupt closure relate to our Venn diagram? What aspect of sustainable transition was not being adequately considered? I'd like you to take another 10 seconds to share your thoughts with your partner now. Time up. Abrupt closure meant that climate action had an instant negative effect on workers. Workers and local communities were not adequately considered in decisions being made. And if we focus too much then on the economy and there's a lack of engagement with people, we're at risk of leaving people behind. This difficult period of history illustrates an imbalance of power. These groups on the slide are all stakeholders in the green transition. We have national government, local government, fossil fuel company, and workers. And there are more, of course, but we're going to focus on these four. They are all involved in or impacted by climate policies and decisions that are made as a result. So, how is the power distributed? Who do you think has the majority of power and why? And what does it look like? So I'd like to invite you in groups of 4 to create an image, either by drawing it or with your bodies, to show the hierarchy of power as you understand it here. So one person representing each stakeholder, and make a visual image of that power dynamics at play. I'd like you to pause the video now and take 5 minutes for this activity. I hope you enjoyed that. I'd love to see some of those images. If you recorded them, do share. Okay, so who's got the power? Speaking with communities in the Midlands through the Reimagine project, there's a feeling that there's little evidence of just transition in day-to-day life on the ground. Many communities express kind of uncertainty around how the funding will be spent, and there's a lack of outreach and engagement and a lack of interest, it seems, in the vision and ideas of the local community. So many are beginning to feel left behind in the transition away from peat towards green industry. And that's a real difficulty. So transition and climate action have become associated a little bit with negative realities because the only winners seem to be those in positions of power. Companies are moving on, which is great, essential, but the old skills aren't necessarily transferable, and there's a danger that the drive towards establishing new technologies and greening companies, which is obviously very important, is leaving local workers behind. These communities also feel a sense of loss as their history and that part that they played in the national story is being erased and essentially forgotten. As one member of the community remarked, to take urgent climate action, a truly just transition is needed, one which places communities yet again at the heart of the national advancement, just like our nation did in the 1950s with the establishment of Ardnamona villages. So instead of building on the success of this past transition, however, climate action is becoming associated with injustice and viewed as an instrument of injustice because the only winners seem to be those in positions of power. So that's where climate justice movement comes in. I want you to take 30 seconds now to share with your partner or group your thoughts about this image. Many of the communities that are now in danger of being left behind by climate action are doubly at risk due to other factors, such as class, race, gender, rural isolation, lack of access to education, and more. And climate justice is essentially about recognising the fact that the climate crisis disproportionately affects people who are low income, especially Black, Brown, Indigenous people. And they are also, those people are the ones who are going to have the least resources to cope with the changes that climate change brings. For example, right now we're experiencing a cost of living crisis and an energy crisis, and those people who are most at risk of fuel poverty are also unable to afford kind of insulation for their houses. So that's a good example of how it's a double injustice. Because climate activists and trade unionists are aware of this imbalance of power that we've explored and the real danger that climate action could negatively impact on people's human rights and quality of life if not done well, they emphasise the need for social dialogue and social inclusion as essential aspects of achieving the just transition. NESC, who are the National Economic and Social Council, recommends that there is a clear need for definitions and indicators as to what constitutes justice, justice for whom, and according to whom. And this needs to be co-created with vulnerable groups rather than imposed from the top down. ILO guidelines also foreground social dialogue as an essential foundation for the development of goals and policies around the green transition. And they state that it should be adequate, ongoing, and inclusive of all stakeholders. And that's a key guiding principle. In other words, a democratic and egalitarian approach which puts climate action and social justice together on a shared timeline. Climate justice recognises that we can't tackle climate change solely through technological solutions, changing from fossil fuels and renewable energy alone, although that is very important. We cannot risk focusing overly on the economic side of things and the technological solutions without due consideration to the human, cultural, and societal impacts. So human rights, equality, inclusion all need to be embedded in the approach. Why is this important, do you think? What kinds of problems could arise if social dialogue is not engaged with in a meaningful way? I want you to take 30 seconds to share your ideas with your partner now. Okay, that's time up. Thank you for sharing. Maybe you came up with some of these ideas. Injustice and poverty, unemployment and social unrest, disengaged citizens maybe, these all compromise the effectiveness of democracy for everyone. And just transition can only work if everyone feels that their voice is as valid as anyone else's, which is often not the case, unfortunately. Down doesn't work. We need progressive solutions that solve the problems of injustice and climate change in tandem. We can't operate in silos. We can't solve the housing crisis alone. We need to solve it in a way that is climate smart and people friendly. As social dialogue is central to just transition, I'm going to invite you now to draw or physically create an image to represent good social dialogue and social inclusion. I want you to think about the same stakeholders maybe as you worked with in the first activity and work with the same group and take another 5 minutes, and you can also draw something if you prefer. How would this image of social justice, social dialogue rather, and social inclusion look different to the first image that you made of power? What changed in the relationship between the people involved? Great, thank you for that. I'd imagine that the power was more evenly distributed in this image, and hopefully listening factored more, and that's key if we want to achieve a just transition. So we're almost at the end of our time together. Thank you very much for participating today. I hope you've got a slightly deeper understanding of what a just transition is. Maybe this has raised some more questions for you, and I'd really encourage you to probe these a little bit deeper. If you'd like to learn more, or if you'd like to follow up at all, feel free to get in touch. To end today, I'd like to invite you, either as a class or individually, to consider what a just transition should look like on the ground in your community, and to capture that in words and images. So this activity could be completed in school or it could be done at home. To get you started, I'm going to share some ideas that the communities in the Midlands came up with when we asked the same question. And I'd like to thank my colleague Irene Nihulawan for creating these images from their ideas. So here we have environment and family life. Ideas like planting trees, forest gardening, and thinking about new family traditions on the bog featured. Here's work, balance, security, community and employment opportunities in the green economy all came up. Thinking about communal spaces prompted ideas about shared community ownership and participation in decision making. Sharing skills as well as tools also featured. and privatisation was seen as a potential block of this kind of communal sharing. Now finally we have transport. E-bikes, inclusive and accessible transport solutions came out of this conversation. Thanks again for your time. Enjoy the rest of the Climate and Nature Summit, and don't forget to talk about what you learn with your family and friends. And I wish you all the very best. Slán.